How do perception and action relate to each other? And this is not a trivial question because we've already seen when we talked about visual perception how light falls on the retina, gets converted into neural signals that then get sent to the back of the brain and so forth. Now, when it then comes to action, these neural signals are then converted into muscle contractions and into actual physical output. So, how do we actually get from light energy at the input point to physical actions as output? And you can see that this is not trivial, and people are actually very adept at this. Because here's even a young kid learning how to swing the baseball. That ball can be thrown with a pretty substantial speed, especially if you look at professional baseball players. And yet we can very, very rapidly align the visual input of this ball changing and moving to the output by our body, the action we perform of this baseball bat, meeting that visual input exactly at the right time and place. So how do these things relate? The perception action cycle is a term for the link between perception and action, where patterns get transformed, visual patterns, sensory patterns get transformed and then turned into coordinated patterns of movement. Of course, that transformation also allows people to integrate visual information and information stemming from their actions. So you also get proprioceptive information from acting. And then what that allows you to do is also to see and make sure that actions actually proceed in the way that you plan them to. So the term for this is what's called the forward model or the motor program. And the idea is the following. When we make a movement, our brain controls that movement. And the brain actually sends out commands to the muscle so that muscle contractions happen and then we move. But while that's happening, the brain also keeps sort of a copy of those commands. And based on that copy, makes predictions about what kind of sensory information should be coming back in if the action is going the way it should. So for example, if you know that you're trying to hit a baseball, the brain sends the commands that lead to the baseball swing. Based on those commands, it's of course, quote unquote, hoping that the ball is going to be hit. So based on that, you can make a prediction that there should be sensory information coming in that corresponds to the ball being hit. If that information does not come in, the brain can now signal that there's something wrong and it could start trying to correct for it. So what happens here is that the prediction that's made is compared with the actual sensory consequences of the action. If they match up, everything is great. If they don't match up, it's a signal that some sort of correction needs to take place. So forward models, really what they do is that they help us in guiding actions by steering people towards the goal of the action that they try to achieve. And what's interesting about this is that through this mechanism, the brain also somewhat cancels out the actions that we are performing compared to actions that other people perform towards us. So what I mean by this is the following. This is an odd question, but you probably have never really wondered why it is that you can't truly tickle yourself. And the reason for it is the following. When you apply tickling sensations to one of your own body parts, the brain is making those movements. So the brain is actually sending out commands, and it's also based on those commands predicting what kinds of sensory consequences are coming back in. Because of that expectation, the sensory information that now comes back in gets in some ways canceled out. So it's a process called sensory cancellation. And because of that cancellation, those movements don't feel ticklish. When another person does this to you, you don't have the predictive commands. So you don't know what to predict. And because of that, there's no sensory cancellation. And now it actually feels very ticklish. And what's interesting about this too is that it is known that people with schizophrenia tend to have some sort of damage somewhere in their forward model. So there's something that goes wrong about the link between actions they produce and then the predicted sensory consequences and them being linked to each other. And if you start thinking that through, that is actually a very basic um, deficit that carries enormous consequences. So when we perform actions, the brain applies sensory cancellation, and as a result of that, we know that, I know that when I'm grabbing a cup of coffee, the sensory information that comes back in matches that, and now I know that I'm the one who's controlling this. If there is a mismatch, and I don't know if the sensory information is coming from me or from somebody else, it makes sense that the brain starts thinking that maybe, my hand is controlled by some other creature or something like that. And this is exactly one of the hallmark symptoms of schizophrenia. Same thing turns out to happen with them hearing voices. So that's another common symptom of schizophrenia, unfortunately. There have been studies where people have looked at activation in the speech muscles in the mouth. And it turns out that when you're sitting around, believe it or not, if you're being asked to think about a particular thing or a particular sentence, people or scientists have recorded activation in the speech muscles that even if you're not speaking, they can reliably identify muscle activation patterns that actually would correspond to whatever the speech would be if you were actually verbalizing it. So in other words, we can read from your speech muscles in some ways what you're thinking. Now, healthy people don't notice this because, again, this is canceled out due to sensory cancellation. However, if people with schizophrenia don't have this, those speech muscles are generating sensory input, the slightest bit, but it's there, and the brain doesn't know where it's coming from. So it makes sense then that the brain interprets this as if it's hearing voices. And again, that's one of the hallmark symptoms of schizophrenia. So there's a lot of research going on now to really figure out exactly what happens in the forward model in that particular patient group. And if that can be figured out, that would be extremely helpful, because it may be that even though it seems like this, well, it's a tremendously impactful clinical disorder, the root of it may be lying in a very basic connection between the prediction of or the execution of our own actions and then predictions about the sensory consequences and them not canceling each other out properly. Another example of how perception and action are linked to each other can be very easily shown by a very simple study, where basically what people did here was investigate the notion of motor priming. And motor priming is just a word for a tendency for when people watch a movement to then actually have that facilitate the same motor response in their own bodies. So this maybe when you watch sports, that sometimes when they throw a football and somebody needs to make a certain move to catch it, you almost feel your own body move. Or in soccer, when a penalty kick is about to be taken, you're almost leaning your body over to the left or the right side. That's an indication that there's some sort of motor priming going on. You can show this very systematically in a very simple study. And in this study, there was just a very simple task people had to perform. So you're watching a screen, and on that screen, there was either a little movie of a hand spreading apart or a hand grasping. And while that was in the background, this was not actually relevant for the task. All that was relevant was that the color of the monitor would change to either red or blue. And depending on whether it was red or blue, participants were instructed to either spread their hand or to clench their hand like a grasping movement. What they found here was that when people saw the same movement on the screen as they were supposed to be making, this actually primed their motor system and they could perform the task more quickly. So this was through motor priming. You see the movement being made, this primed the same movements in their own bodies, and now they actually are better able to perform that task. So again, that speaks to the tight link between perception and action, and I'll give some other examples of how that plays out when people have done a lot of research on that particular topic.